What civilization would adorn its walls with the skin of its foes as a message to the world? The Neo-Assyrian Empire, referred to as Mat-Assur in the Akkadian language, was more than just one of the ancient world's most formidable military machines. It was an administration founded upon systematized dread. Between the 9th and 7th centuries BCE, the kings of Assyria forged a new approach to warfare, one in which victory was only final after every survivor had witnessed the high cost of defiance. This terror was deliberate. The aftermath of a victorious siege was carefully staged to deliver a clear signal, not just to the conquered, but to any nation that was watching. Cities that had the audacity to resist were converted into public arenas for retribution. The bodies of the slain were suspended from posts, pierced through on spikes, or simply abandoned to decompose in the streets. Captured individuals were maimed and paraded through the smoldering ruins bound in iron chains. These actions were not the product of isolated savagery, but were state-sanctioned spectacles, profoundly ingrained in the official policy of Assyrian royalty. Records from the era of Ashurnasirpal II, from 883 to 859 BCE, recount these methods with an unnerving lack of emotion. I struck down 3,000 of their warriors with the sword and took many captive. Some had their arms and hands severed, while others lost their noses, ears, or other extremities. I blinded many among them. However, the most dreaded punishment was flaying, the act of stripping the skin from a person, living or dead, and fastening it to city walls as a grim deterrent. These grim tasks were not carried out by common foot soldiers, but by officially designated torturers and royal executioners skilled in this work. Carved reliefs from King Sennacherib's palace in Nineveh depict these executioners, some hooded, others bareheaded, inflicting punishments with a terrifying level of precision. These retributions were orchestrated in public squares or just outside the city gates. At times, aristocrats or the rulers of a city were compelled to observe the executions of their own family members before they themselves were blinded, put in shackles, and led in chains to the capitals of Assur or Nineveh. The very design of Assyrian capital cities featured designated plazas for these displays, reinforcing obedience through ritualistic brutality. The Assyrian deployment of fear was not random. It was a core institution. The ruthlessness of their military operations was chronicled on stone, meticulously saved in official archives, and put into practice by trained operatives of the state. Fear was the currency of their empire, and they wielded it with savage efficiency. Impalement as a warning. The Assyrian signature. Among the punishments of the ancient world, few could rival the horrifying display of Assyrian impalement. It was more than a mere execution. It was a theatrical performance, a warning carved into the medium of public punishment. The Assyrians, during the peak of their influence in the 8th and 7th centuries BCE, utilized impalement as their most emblematic and ghastly tool of terror. It became their hallmark method of execution, employed not for simple convenience, but for its powerful symbolism. This practice turned human bodies into cautionary monuments, transforming the act of resistance into an outdoor exhibit of compliance enforced by dread. Assyrian records frequently mention the practice. From the rule of Tiglath-Pileser the Third, who reigned from 745 to 727 BCE, an inscription reads, "I heaped up the corpses of their warriors in front of the gates. I impaled their nobles on stakes." The selected targets were typically local governors, rebel commanders, or captives of high status, chosen precisely for the chilling deterrent effect of their public suffering. These victims were pierced on tall wooden stakes, frequently positioned right outside the gates of their home cities. Their bodies were left there to decay, serving as towering reminders to anyone who would enter or leave. The Assyrians held the belief that a punishment witnessed by the public amplified its impact far beyond the individual, searing it into the consciousness of the living. The executioners, who were a part of the state apparatus, were skilled not only in the art of killing but also in psychological warfare. The positioning of each stake was critical. Its height, its angle, and its placement were all carefully deliberated. A row of impaled bodies encircling a city's defensive wall served as a silent and inescapable lesson. This is the fate that awaits any rebellion. Reliefs from the palace of Ashurnasirpal II at Nimrud show these very scenes in grim detail. Bodies pierced by stakes, slumping under their own weight, as soldiers observed dispassionately. The practice was a blend of legal sentencing and political propaganda. Following a siege, military scribes would document who was impaled and for what reason. Their names and offenses were inscribed on nearby tablets or walls. This was not a punishment to be hidden away in a dungeon. It was a form of public justice, engineered to shatter morale and secure unwavering obedience in the future. Assyrian impalement was never just about retribution. It was a finely tuned instrument of political dominance. Mass deportations. Controlling through fear. What manner of empire maintains its existence not by fostering allegiance, but by displacing entire societies? The Assyrian Empire, especially during the leadership of kings such as Tiglath-Pileser the Third, Sargon II, and Esarhaddon, developed one of the ancient world's most methodical policies of population management: mass deportation. In contrast to the incidental displacement that war often causes, this was a deliberate government strategy, conceived to dismantle opposition from its very foundation. Deportation was not a disorganized byproduct of conquest. It was a core strategy. When a city or territory revolted, Assyrian armies would crush it without delay and then proceed to tear apart its social structure. Entire populations, including families, artisans, the nobility, and farmers, were ripped from their native lands and forced to march hundreds of miles to unfamiliar territories across the empire. These forced migrations were documented with great care in royal inscriptions and on clay tablets stored within the imperial archives. Sargon II, following his conquest of Samaria in 722 BCE, famously declared, "I counted 27,290 people. I carried them off to Assyria." The displaced people were not executed. Their lives were spared not from compassion, but for their strategic value. They were relocated to distant areas, often hostile territories that Assyria had recently conquered, where their settlement achieved two goals. They would develop the agriculture and infrastructure for the empire, and their presence would dilute the local population with foreign, uprooted peoples, thus preventing any unified uprisings. Executioners and soldiers managed the entire operation. Anyone who resisted was handled swiftly, punished severely, sometimes through execution or being made a public example. Families were occasionally separated, religious centers were demolished, and local languages were suppressed. The psychological shock of being displaced, transported on foot over desolate terrain, was an integral part of the punishment. Later classical writings, including fragments credited to the Babylonian historian Berossus, comment on the bewildering legacy of these Assyrian deportations. Whole populations resettled among unfamiliar faces and stripped of their original identities. While Assyrian royal records proudly enumerate the towns they repopulate with foreign workers and praise their renewed output, the human toll of this policy is tragically clear. Mass deportation was the Assyrian solution for defiance. It was not genocide, but survival by dispersion, breaking societies into pieces and reconfiguring them as instruments of the empire. Burning cities alive. Scorched earth warfare. What occurs when victory alone is not the endgame, and annihilation itself becomes the objective? For the Assyrian Empire, especially under the rule of Ashurnasirpal II, Sennacherib, and Ashurbanipal, a triumph was not concluded with a military surrender. It reached its climax in total destruction. Cities that dared to resist were not just seized, they were systematically obliterated, usually with fire, in a strategy that historians today identify as one of the earliest documented uses of scorched earth warfare. The Assyrians didn't just punish the leadership, they punished the very landscape. Entire cities were methodically reduced to cinders, their temples plundered, their food stores incinerated, and their inhabitants either scattered or massacred. This act was intentional. It was designed not only to undermine any future attempts at resistance, but also to forge a memory of fear so profound that it would resonate throughout the ancient Near East. Ashurnasirpal II documented one such campaign. "I stormed the city. I destroyed, devastated, and burned it with fire. The corpses of their warriors I piled up. Their men and women I burned. These acts were not merely recorded, they were glorified. Palace reliefs from Nineveh and Nimrud depict the smoke-filled ruin of enemy cities, showing flames erupting over walls as Assyrian soldiers march in disciplined ranks below. These images, carved into limestone and displayed in royal chambers, were not just warnings, they were symbols of conquest. One of the most notorious instances took place in 701 BCE, during Sennacherib's military expedition against the Kingdom of Judah. Although Jerusalem was ultimately spared after a siege, other cities like Lachish were not so fortunate. Archaeological findings confirm that the city of Lachish was completely incinerated, its gate shrine desecrated, and its defenders crushed in a savage assault. The ultimate horror unfolded after the flames subsided. Any survivors were often abandoned in the ruins without access to food, water, or any form of leadership. Temples and idols were plundered, with sacred items transported back to Assur or Nineveh as potent symbols of supremacy. As Ashurnasirpal documented, "I carried off the gods of Elam, their treasures and people, I burned their cities, I turned them into ruined mounds." The Assyrian Empire mastered the application of fire as an instrument of politics. Cities were not simply conquered, they were engineered to disappear. The message sent was clear: rebellion would not just be defeated, it would be utterly erased from existence. The legacy of the Assyrian Empire is carved not just in stone reliefs and shattered cities, but in its grim mastery of fear as a mechanism of power. Through calculated terror, forced migrations, and the fiery annihilation of entire civilizations, they fundamentally altered the ancient Near East and demonstrated how an empire can devolve into tyranny through cruelty. Can the shadow of Assyria still inform us today about the perils of unrestrained power? Share your thoughts in the comments below. As Ashurnasirpal II recorded, "In the midst of the mighty mountains I slaughtered them. With their blood I dyed the mountains red like wool."